In early September 2025, something unusual happened along the quiet border between Ghana and Burkina Faso. Over 230 commercial trucks, many loaded with food and essential goods, came to a grinding halt. The drivers, frustrated and stranded for days, began to protest. Their livelihoods were on the line. But what caused this sudden disruption? A newly enforced policy from Burkina Faso's government banned vehicles longer than 54 feet from entering the country. No advance notice, no transition period, just a hard stop. And the consequences were immediate. Supply chains broke down, perishable goods began to rot, and tempers boiled over. While border officials scrambled to implement the changes, what truly caught the world's attention was the direct involvement of Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré. Days earlier, he had visited the nation's northern front lines, not to address truck drivers, but to rally soldiers tasked with defending the border from terrorist infiltration. His message was clear. The stakes are about more than trade. They are about survival, sovereignty, and national security. Could it be that the new restrictions are less about logistics and more about fear? Fear of weapons, drugs, and insurgents hiding among trade convoys? Or is there something deeper at play, like rising distrust between neighbors or unease about Ghana's growing ties with the United States? Stay with us, because this story reveals more than just a border dispute. It uncovers a fragile balance between cooperation and control, between security and suffering. If stories like this matter to you, stories of people, power, and principle, then subscribe now. The next few minutes could change the way you see West Africa forever. On September 3, 2025, Burkina Faso introduced a new border regulation that caught nearly everyone off guard. Trucks exceeding 54 feet in length would no longer be allowed to enter the country. The policy took effect immediately, without any grace period or formal consultation with Ghanaian officials. The result? Chaos. Within 48 hours, more than 230 Ghanaian commercial vehicles were stuck at the Paga border crossing, many carrying time-sensitive and perishable goods like fish, vegetables, and medical supplies. Drivers, unprepared for such a sudden enforcement, found themselves trapped in a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare. While some managed to secure passage by paying what they described as fees of up to 500,000 CFA francs, roughly $850, others were told to either wait indefinitely or physically alter their trucks to meet the new size requirements. For those who couldn't pay or comply, the border remained sealed. This was not a minor disruption. It was a full-blown blockade with immediate financial and humanitarian consequences. Truckers slept in their vehicles for days, sometimes weeks, food spoiled under the sun. Tempers flared. A protest began to swell. Behind the growing tension, however, lay a deeper unease. Why had Burkina Faso imposed such a drastic measure with no warning? According to reports from Burkinabe officials, the policy was introduced as part of a broader national security strategy. Intelligence had suggested that terrorist groups were smuggling weapons, drugs, and even fighters across the border, hidden within seemingly legitimate trade cargo. Long vehicles with more concealed space were deemed a particular risk. But to many Ghanaian drivers and traders, the policy felt like collective punishment. One driver, Emmanuel Mensah, who had been transporting refrigerated fish, explained, "This isn't just about money. My cargo is spoiling every hour. My clients are canceling orders. And no one is telling us how long this will last." For small-scale operators like Emmanuel, even a few days of delay can mean financial ruin. Several drivers reported that Burkinabe border agents demanded payment in cash, unofficially, and warned that non-compliant vehicles could be cut down before being allowed entry. These stories circulated rapidly, fueling rumors of corruption and worsening distrust between border communities. Adding to the confusion, the Ghanaian authorities were slow to respond. By the time officials from Ghana's border security and local assemblies arrived, tensions had already reached a boiling point. Many truckers felt abandoned, caught in a dispute they neither started nor fully understood. Meanwhile, Burkinabe media emphasized the importance of vigilance, quoting government sources who warned of terrorist plots and potential cross-border infiltration. The narrative from Ouagadougou was clear: national security comes first. Yet the method of implementation, sudden, unilateral, and harsh, raised serious questions about transparency, diplomacy, and the human cost of such measures. Historically, Ghana and Burkina Faso have enjoyed relatively open borders, sharing not only trade, but also culture, language, and family ties across communities. The abrupt shift in policy marked a significant departure from that tradition, and it left many wondering, is this a temporary security move or a sign of something more permanent? Could this be a new era of hardened borders in West Africa, driven by fear rather than cooperation? The silence from ECOWAS, the regional body responsible for economic integration, only deepened the sense of isolation. With no clear mediation or joint statement, local actors were left to improvise solutions, often clashing in the process. The truckers' protests soon turned tactical. Some began targeting food trucks, blocking them intentionally to force authorities to act, not out of malice, but desperation. As one protest leader said, if the food starts to rot, someone will pay attention. Eventually, a joint task force involving police, customs, and military units managed to restore calm. Some vehicles were allowed to pass. Others remained stuck. And still, no one knew exactly what the next day would bring. Was this an isolated decision? Or was it part of a broader strategic shift in Burkina Faso's border doctrine? One thing was certain: the consequences were already spilling far beyond the checkpoint at Paga. But what triggered such a drastic move in the first place? And why now, after years of relatively stable cooperation? The answers may lie not just in trade data or policy memos, but in a growing climate of fear, distrust, and shifting alliances. The next part of our story dives deeper into the moment where frustration exploded into full-scale protest and where President Traoré's rhetoric took on a new, electrifying urgency. But first, what exactly turned this border dispute into a national emergency? As days passed and trucks remained stuck, frustrations boiled over into visible, organized protest. Hundreds of Ghanaian truck drivers, exhausted and financially desperate, gathered in large numbers at the Paga border crossing. Their voices echoed with anger and confusion. Some held makeshift signs. Others stood defiantly in front of incoming vehicles. But what caught the most attention were their actions. Drivers began blocking perishable food trucks, not out of malice, but to force authorities to respond. By grounding essential goods, they hoped to pressure both governments to resolve the crisis. "We're not doing this to hurt people," one protester said. "But we've been here for 2 weeks. Nobody is listening. Maybe if the food spoils, someone will care." Their tactics, though controversial, were effective. Word spread quickly, and local news outlets began covering the blockade. Public attention grew. Traders on both sides of the border started raising concerns about rising food prices and empty shelves. The human cost of the impasse was becoming undeniable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, a very different scene was unfolding. Days before the protests escalated, President Ibrahim Traoré had made a surprise visit to a northern military outpost near the border, not to address the truck drivers directly, but to deliver a powerful message to the soldiers stationed there. His speech, raw and emotional, was broadcast across local media. He reminded his troops of their mission, not just to enforce border rules, but to defend the nation's very survival. Standing before rows of dusty, fatigued soldiers, he said, "This population sees in you their only hope for life. Give them that hope. Allow them to live. You are made for this." His words carried more than patriotic inspiration. They signaled a dramatic elevation of the border's significance. It was no longer just a place of trade. It had become a front line, a place where Burkina Faso's sovereignty was being tested daily, not only by external threats, but by what his government perceived as systemic vulnerabilities in the region's open border model. The symbolism of Traoré's appearance was powerful. A president in fatigues, speaking directly to frontline troops, evoked images of wartime leadership. His message was not just for domestic audiences. It was a signal to the world. Burkina Faso was drawing a line. But if his speech galvanized some, it alarmed others. In Ghana, the optics of soldiers patrolling borders and restricting trade triggered concern among government officials and civil society groups alike. Was Burkina Faso preparing for conflict, or simply taking preemptive steps to secure its territory? Ghanaian media began asking tough questions. Why wasn't there a bilateral agreement before the regulation was enforced? Could these kinds of unilateral actions escalate into long-term trade wars? At the grassroots level, the disconnect was even starker. Many Ghanaian drivers had family members in Burkina Faso. Some even worked cross-border routes for years without incident. One driver, Kofi Asante, whose father was born in Ouagadougou, said, "I've been driving this road since I was 22. Never had trouble. Now I'm treated like a threat." His story captured the emotional core of the crisis. Not just lost income, but a loss of trust, of shared identity across borders. The Joint Task Force, comprising customs officers, military personnel, and immigration agents, eventually stepped in to mediate the growing unrest. Their presence helped de-escalate tensions temporarily. A few vehicles were allowed to pass under tight supervision. Others were redirected or told to wait until further notice. Yet the underlying issues remained unresolved. Protesters warned that if no permanent solution was found within 24 hours, they would return to the roads and resume their blockade. The crisis was no longer just about border logistics. It had become a test of leadership, diplomacy, and regional stability. President Traoré's rhetoric had elevated the moment, but in doing so, he also raised the stakes. What began as a policy shift had now become a full-blown political flashpoint. And for every truck that moved, another waited. For every problem eased, a new complication arose. As night fell over the borderlands, there was still no clear path forward. The question on everyone's mind was no longer just about road access. It was about where this all was heading. What would happen next if no compromise was reached? Could trade relations between Ghana and Burkina Faso recover from this rupture? And as other West African nations watched from the sidelines, would they learn or follow? The ripple effects of the border blockade between Ghana and Burkina Faso were swift, severe, and deeply personal. What began as a sudden enforcement of a logistical regulation quickly became a humanitarian and political crisis affecting thousands. Markets on both sides of the border felt the shock first. In northern Ghana, particularly in Tamale and Bolgatanga, traders watched helplessly as prices of onions, tomatoes, and fish surged overnight. A sack of onions that cost 150 cedis last week now sells for 280, complained Adiza, a market vendor who has supplied produce from Burkina Faso for over a decade. My customers can't afford it. I'm losing them one by one. In Burkina Faso, the effects were no less dramatic. In the towns of Po and Bobo Dioulasso, merchants reliant on Ghanaian imports struggled to restock shelves. Medical centers reported delays in receiving basic pharmaceuticals. Small businesses that depended on cross-border supply chains saw their margins collapse. One pharmacy owner in Ouagadougou reported that a week-long delay in deliveries meant insulin was running dangerously low for diabetic patients. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were existential threats to livelihood and life. Among the most heart-wrenching stories was that of a trucker named Ibrahim Traoré. He had been transporting refrigerated fish to Bobo Dioulasso when the blockade began. With no cold storage facilities nearby, he watched his cargo rot in real time. I lost over 25,000 cedis in one shipment, he said. That was supposed to pay for my daughter's school fees. Ibrahim's story echoed across the region as hundreds of other drivers faced similar losses with little to no compensation or official guidance. The silence from both governments in the early days of the crisis only deepened the sense of abandonment. In Ghana, the political fallout was immediate. Citizens began questioning the preparedness and responsiveness of their government. Radio talk shows lit up with callers demanding accountability. "Where is our foreign affairs minister?" one caller asked. "How can another country change a major border policy overnight and we do nothing?" Opposition leaders seized the moment, criticizing the ruling party for lacking both diplomatic foresight and crisis management. The government eventually responded, sending envoys to meet with Burkinabe counterparts. But the delay in action had already damaged public trust. Some critics warned that Ghana's reliance on diplomatic niceties had left its citizens vulnerable to unpredictable foreign decisions. In Burkina Faso, the political narrative was more controlled, but cracks were beginning to show. State television repeated the official line. The border restrictions were necessary to combat terrorism. But within local business communities, frustration grew. "We support the fight against terrorism," said one shop owner in Leo, near the Ghanaian border. "But it shouldn't come at the cost of starving our families." Civil society groups quietly raised concerns about the lack of public consultation and the heavy-handed nature of enforcement. A few dared to suggest that the blockade might be about more than just security. Was it also political posturing? A strategic message to Ghana, and perhaps to the West? The regional implications were no less concerning. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, was founded to foster integration, ease movement, and promote unity across borders. Yet as the crisis unfolded, ECOWAS remained conspicuously quiet. Days passed before the organization issued a tepid statement urging dialogue and mutual respect. For many observers, the silence signaled a deeper problem. ECOWAS lacked both the authority and agility to mediate fast-moving disputes between member states. This failure raised new questions about the future of regional cooperation. If Burkina Faso could act unilaterally on a matter as vital as trade, what was to stop other nations from following suit? Could Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, or Togo decide to impose sudden restrictions next, citing security or sovereignty? Could the fragile dream of regional unity collapse under the weight of mutual suspicion? The psychological toll on affected populations was immense. Farmers feared their harvests would rot. Parents worried about affording school supplies as prices spiked. Traders expressed a loss of confidence in cross-border commerce, the very backbone of many northern economies. The social fabric, already frayed by years of insecurity, felt another tear. In border communities, there was also a palpable sense of betrayal. "We are neighbors," said Kwaku, a food wholesaler in Bolgatanga. "We share families, languages, history. But now it feels like a wall is being built." What made the situation even more volatile was the perceived uneven enforcement. Reports of some drivers being allowed to pass after paying large fees sparked rumors of corruption. Such stories, whether verified or not, undermined the legitimacy of the policy and fueled resentment. Security analysts warned that the situation, if left unresolved, could breed unrest not just among truckers, but within wider civil society. If economic pain continued to deepen, protests could spread, and political pressure would mount in both capitals. But perhaps the most troubling outcome was intangible: the erosion of trust. Trust between governments, trust between border agencies, and trust between people who once saw each other not as threats, but as partners. With so much already lost, the region now stood at a dangerous crossroads, and the question loomed larger than ever. How would the international community, particularly powerful actors like the United States, respond to this deepening fracture in West Africa's fragile unity? As tensions at the Ghana-Burkina Faso border escalated, the international community began paying closer attention, not just because of the economic implications, but because of the underlying geopolitics that had been quietly brewing for months. At the heart of this deeper story is a question few dared to ask openly. Could Burkina Faso's sudden border crackdown be, in part, a response to Ghana's growing ties with the United States? For leaders in Ouagadougou, the answer may be yes. Over the past 2 years, Ghana has significantly expanded its military and diplomatic cooperation with Washington. In 2023, the two nations renewed the Defense Cooperation Agreement, allowing U.S. troops access to certain military facilities in Ghana. Joint training exercises have increased. Intelligence sharing has deepened, and American officials have frequently praised Ghana as a pillar of stability in an increasingly volatile region. But not everyone sees this partnership in such glowing terms. In Burkina Faso, a nation battling insurgency, political pressure, and regional isolation, the growing U.S.-Ghana alliance has raised red flags. To some within Traoré's government, Ghana's open-door approach to American influence appears not as a stabilizing force, but as a strategic risk. What if those same alliances are used to project influence deeper into the Sahel? What if trade routes become intelligence channels? Or worse, corridors for covert intervention? Such suspicions, though not publicly confirmed, have surfaced in Burkina Faso's state media narratives. Commentators and analysts aligned with the regime have subtly suggested that foreign powers, particularly the United States, may be using regional allies to encircle or undermine governments that resist Western models. From this perspective, the decision to tighten border controls, especially with Ghana, takes on new meaning. It's not just about weapons or contraband. It's about control, about preventing what some perceive as a quiet encroachment of foreign power. Analysts in Washington have taken note. Several policy briefings in August and September 2025 flagged growing anti-Western sentiment in Sahel nations, especially those led by military or transitional governments. The U.S. State Department issued a measured statement urging calm, cooperation, and respect for trade agreements. but refrained from directly commenting on the security rationale behind Burkina Faso's policy. Privately, however, American diplomats are said to be concerned. A breakdown in Ghana-Burkina Faso relations could destabilize trade corridors crucial for both humanitarian aid and counterterrorism logistics. More broadly, it could fracture the delicate balance of influence the U.S. maintains in the region. A senior analyst at a Washington-based think tank put it bluntly, "If Ouagadougou sees Accra as a backdoor for U.S. power, we could be entering a new phase of regional tension, not between nations, but between competing visions of sovereignty and foreign alignment." European nations, too, are watching closely. France, still reeling from its diplomatic ouster in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, has maintained a low profile. But European Union trade officials have expressed concern about the blockade's impact on West Africa's fragile supply chains. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs issued a quiet warning. Prolonged disruptions could exacerbate food insecurity in border areas already vulnerable to drought and displacement. Yet, in many ways, the silence has been louder than the statements. No major international actor has taken the lead in mediating the standoff. The crisis has been left to fester, managed piecemeal by local authorities and regional negotiators. That vacuum itself is telling. It suggests a shift in global posture toward the Sahel, a growing reluctance to intervene, a loss of leverage, and a recognition that these nations, many now led by military regimes, are redefining their relationships with the outside world. In this changing context, President Traoré's hardline stance is not just domestic policy, it is a message to the world. A message that Burkina Faso will defend its sovereignty on its own terms, even at the cost of economic pain, diplomatic strain, or regional disapproval. The United States, for its part, faces a delicate challenge: how to maintain strong ties with Ghana, a valued democratic partner, without appearing to threaten the sovereignty of its more cautious neighbors. How to support regional security without being viewed as a shadow actor in internal disputes? The answers are far from simple. But one thing is clear: what happened at the Paga border is not an isolated event. It is a flashpoint in a broader struggle over influence, autonomy, and alignment in post-colonial Africa. If the U.S. misreads the moment, or if Burkina Faso doubles down on suspicion, trust could deteriorate even further. And that leads us to the most urgent question yet. If the lines of trust between nations begin to blur, what kind of future awaits West Africa? Behind the border blockade and the official statements about security lies a far more complex and politically charged reality. One that sheds light not only on Burkina Faso's internal calculations, but also on how President Ibrahim Traoré is reshaping the political identity of his nation. For observers inside and outside the region, the timing of the border restrictions with Ghana was anything but coincidental. It came just weeks after several high-level meetings between Ghanaian officials and American defense representatives, and during a period when Burkina Faso has been steadily moving away from Western partnerships in favor of regional military autonomy. To many within Traoré's administration, the message was clear. Ghana is drifting into a different orbit, one that may be incompatible with Burkina Faso's evolving vision of sovereignty. President Traoré, a young and assertive leader, has positioned himself not merely as a transitional figure, but as a symbol of national resistance against foreign domination. In speeches across the country, he often invokes the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former leader who preached African self-reliance and rejected Western interference. For Traoré, the decision to restrict the border was more than just a tactical move. It was political theater designed to reinforce a narrative of independence and vigilance. Sources close to the administration suggest that there were internal debates leading up to the enforcement of the new vehicle length policy. Some advisors reportedly warned that the move could backfire economically and diplomatically, but hardliners in the security and defense establishment prevailed, arguing that Ghana's openness to U.S. influence posed a strategic risk. By clamping down on border access, they hoped to send a signal not just to Ghana, but to Burkinabe citizens, that national security would not be compromised for convenience. Internally, the policy served another purpose. It galvanized nationalist sentiment at a time when the government faces growing pressure over economic hardship and ongoing security threats. With insurgencies still active in the north and foreign aid declining, the administration needed a unifying narrative. The border became the perfect stage. State media ran stories emphasizing vigilance and self-defense. Footage of President Traoré in fatigues, speaking to troops and warning of infiltration, was broadcast nationwide. "Our enemies may not wear uniforms," he declared. "They may come disguised, hidden among trade. We must remain alert." The imagery was powerful and effective. Among many Burkinabe citizens, especially in rural areas, the president's stance boosted confidence in a government often under siege. In political terms, it drew a sharp line between Traoré and his critics, both domestic and foreign. It also exposed the shifting dynamics within the region. In the past, Burkina Faso had cooperated closely with Ghana on trade, infrastructure, and migration. But as each country's leadership charted a different course, Ghana leaning west, Burkina Faso asserting regional defiance, the shared vision began to fracture. Analysts believe that the crisis could mark a new phase in regional politics, one where ideological alignment matters as much as geography. Countries perceived to be too close to Western interests may find themselves facing informal pushback from neighbors trying to carve out independent spheres of influence. That pushback may not always take the form of speeches or treaties. Sometimes it looks like a checkpoint, a stranded truck, a regulation that seems small on the surface but signals something much larger underneath. And yet, the political gamble carries serious risks. If the policy alienates regional allies or worsens public discontent due to rising prices, it could backfire. Already, some local leaders in Burkina Faso's south have raised quiet concerns. In border towns where trade with Ghana is a lifeline, merchants and transporters are growing restless. They may support sovereignty in principle, but not at the cost of survival. Internationally, the perception of Traoré is evolving. To some, he is a bold and necessary disruptor, challenging a colonial legacy that still casts a long shadow over African affairs. To others, he is a dangerous populist, stoking nationalism to distract from deeper structural problems. In truth, he may be both. Like many leaders before him, he is navigating a volatile mix of public expectation, foreign pressure, and domestic insecurity. The border crisis may not have been caused by politics alone, but politics certainly turned it into a national stage. The question now is how long that stage can hold before cracks begin to show. If the border remains tense, if protests resume, if prices continue to rise, the political capital Traoré has built could quickly erode. And so we are left with a sobering possibility. that what began as a policy to protect the nation may end up testing the very foundations of its leadership. But could the next moves be even more unpredictable? Could a diplomatic misstep or a regional backlash force a deeper political confrontation? As the dust begins to settle at the Ghana-Burkina Faso border, one truth remains unavoidable. This was never just about trucks or trade or even terrorism. It was about trust. Trust between nations, between governments and their people, and between a continent trying to define its own path in a world full of competing influences. The blockade at Paga has exposed not only vulnerabilities in infrastructure and diplomacy, but also in the very fabric of West African unity. If such drastic actions can unfold without warning, what confidence can traders, families, or local businesses have in the stability of cross-border relationships? And more importantly, what happens next time? Because this may not be a one-time crisis. In fact, it could be the opening act of a new era. An era where borders become harder, suspicion runs deeper, and regional cooperation begins to unravel under the weight of strategic fear. Already we're seeing the aftershocks. Other nations in the region are reevaluating their border policies. Rumors circulate about similar inspections being considered in Togo and Niger. And within Burkina Faso, the government's tone remains defiant, its eyes fixed not just on Ghana, but on the global players who influence it. If this trajectory continues, if national security becomes the overriding justification for unilateral action, then the consequences could reach far beyond West Africa. Humanitarian corridors may be closed. Essential goods may become scarce. And ordinary people, as always, will be the first to suffer. But it doesn't have to be this way. Dialogue is still possible. Mutual respect can still prevail. And regional leaders can still choose cooperation over confrontation. The future is not yet written. And that brings us to the heart of today's question. Is Ibrahim Traoré truly the guardian of his nation's sovereignty? Or has he lit a match near the dry kindling of regional instability? Is this firm leadership in the face of real threats, or a miscalculation that may cost more than anyone is prepared to admit? We may not have all the answers today, but the next few weeks will be critical. If, for example, no diplomatic solution is reached within the next 3 months, if border policies remain rigid and retaliatory, we could see the slow collapse of regional trade frameworks like ECOWAS and the reemergence of hardened lines that set African nations apart instead of drawing them together. So we ask you, not just as viewers, but as people who care deeply about the fate of this continent and the principles that hold it together. What kind of Africa do you believe in? One built on isolation and suspicion, or one where security and solidarity walk hand in hand? If this story has stirred something in you, if you felt anger, concern, or even hope, then we ask you to share your voice. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think, because these aren't just policy debates. They are decisions that shape lives. And if you believe, like we do, in justice, in dignity, and in an Africa that stands strong without standing alone, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to stay connected. At this channel, we believe in truth, even when it's uncomfortable, in freedom, even when it's complicated, and in faith, even when the road is uncertain. May the voices of reason rise above the noise. May the leaders of our time be guided by wisdom, not fear. And may God bless the people of Burkina Faso and all of Africa with the strength to choose peace over power, unity over division, and hope over despair.